In my original video, I searched a bunch of old patents that went back as far as the 1800s to try and understand all the extra little bits and bobs on this here seam gauge that go beyond the seam gauging, if you will. And well, it turns out a lot of you folks were interested, as indicated by this here view counter. But not only that, and thank you, a lot of you shared how you use this here seam gauge or hem gauge or knitting gauge, as it's sometimes called, down in the comments. And so I thought to myself, well, why don't I go ahead and go through all these comments and then gather some of the common themes that go beyond the original video and other interesting little quirks and things that I discovered along the way. And I say I came up with the idea. There was actually comments that suggested I should do this follow-up video, but I came up with the idea of doing a follow-up video. So anyways, this is where we find ourselves. Keep it moving, editing corn, intro, yada yada. My name's Cornelius Quiring. That's my logo. That's my word mark. Nothing would feed my ego like selling merch with that branding. First, I need to start with a correction. I did the compassing feature incorrectly in that first video. In the original video, I put the pin in the big hole at the end here, like so, then put my marker in the gap and drew it around like so. But as you can tell, it presents some challenges. The big hole on the end there means that it's a little bit wobbly, but also there, it can slide around. It leads to inaccuracies. What I should be doing instead is putting the pin in this tiny little hole on the gaugey slidey bit here, like that. And then I take my marker and put it in the hole on the end here, and then draw my circle. And as you can tell, it's a better looking circle than I did before because, well, there's a whole lot less movement going on. Which now brings me to one of the uses that was brought up numerous times in the comments, which is to use this feature to draw scallops. And, well, I didn't exactly know what scallops were except for being yummy on my plate. So I did a bit of Googles. It turns out that they are half circles right next to each other. So I just go ahead and draw my line, whoop, like that. Let's say I want my scallops to be 3 inches. Well, then I just slide my gauge over to the 1.5 inch mark. Go ahead and pin it right on that line, right there. Draw my half a circle, gorgeous, and then just repeat over and over. So move that over, align the little circle with where that last one ended, pin down again, draw the next one, and boom, I've got myself some scallops. Yum yum. Not quite sure how to cook these puppies yet, but I'll figure that bit out. In my original video, I was also curious as to why there was 2 holes on each side and wasn't quite sure why that might be. My theory was that one could pin down each side like so and then set an amount as needed and then do whatever I wanted to, but wasn't quite sure what some purposes would be that I could use it for. Well, turns out you folks shared plenty of purposes. Let's say I'm a member of the skirt-wearing crowd. Well, I just happen to fancy myself a circle skirt, and well, that means I've got many yards or meters of hemming to do. First, I pin down on both sides. I then proceed to set my hem amount that I want. Let's pretend it's 1 inch right there. Line up my hem for that beautiful 1 inch spot. Pin that one in place. move along, and continue like that until I've done my hem all the way around. And if I am deciding to press as I go along, the one disadvantage to these new ones is the fact that this little plasticky bit here exists rather than how the old ones had metal, which means I cannot get too close or press on top of this puppy without melting it. Several people in the comments mentioned how they would keep an eye out for old vintage ones and pick them up when they see them. An interesting detail some folks brought up was pinning in at an angle rather than straight up and down. The idea being that it's a little more solid in there. And you know what I gotta say? That is pretty decent. Let me try straight up and down again. You know what? That does wiggle around a little bit more. There is a noticeable difference. Alternatively, a lot of people mentioned actually pinning it straight onto a tailor's form to work the fabric underneath. Cork cutting boards were mentioned, and then most interesting to me was cardboard cutting boards. Oh, and that's 3 O's, not zeros. Cornelius. Ooh. Or honestly, you could probably just click the link in the description. I didn't know this was a thing, but apparently it was more popular further back in time in the 60s, 70s sort of time period. And they're these accordion style foldable thick cardboard surfaces which you could lay your fabric on top of, put the pattern on top of that, pin it all down, trim that puppy out, and voila. Apparently plastic warps over time, and so some folks were theorizing that these little holes here were to add some movement and give into the little gagey plastic bits. So who knows? Why not, let's add that theory to the list as well. Yet another reason for these little holes is to do a tailor's tack. And a tailor's tack is basically a way of marking fabric with thread so that you don't have to draw on it. So let's say I want to do a 2-inch tailor's tack, line that up with the edge, go over to the 2-inch mark, take my needle and thread, put that through like so, and voila, take the seam gauge away. I then proceed to just put my needle through like so, back again, through the same little holes, leave that nice and slack, snip, 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 and voila. I have marked my 2-inch spot. And then when I need to remove it, I just pull that sucker out and it's gone. And I haven't marked or damaged my fabric in any way. So, tailor's tack with a little hole. Who knew? Such a tiny hole could do so much. Next, let's talk about these notches here. The most common use by far was for buttonholes. So let's say this is going to be one here, and I want them all 3 inches apart. I now know where the center of the next one is. Move that over, and that way I can nice and evenly and consistently mark off where I'm going to place them. In terms of deciding the height of my buttonholes, well, I just simply take my button, I slide it in that little gap here, then I push the gauge up against the edge until it's sitting flush. And so now I know the size of my button, plus I've got a little bit of easing on the end here to make it easier to put the button on. So in my case, it looks like I'm making my buttonhole 5/8 of an inch. Pretty clever, huh? Now, this of course does have its limitations. If say I'm going with a slightly bigger button and well yeah, that that will not be going through there. And then when it comes to doing the buttons on the other placket, well, I simply slide the gauge bit over to the 3 inches, line that up, and then use the tiny little hole here to poke through and leave a little marking, like so. And voila, that is where I'll be doing my button. I'm telling you, these little holes here are turning out to be rather useful. In the original video, I was also wondering, why are the notches an inch apart and not a different amount? And then I found some older seam gauges where those notches were half an inch apart. And some rather astute commenter pointed out that garments in the 1900s and earlier were much more intricate than we make them today, and so those half-inch spacings were much more useful. And with our slightly pared back garments, well, an inch apart is plenty. So there you go. And then another rather clever commenter pointed out that if I still wanted my half-inch markings after I've made all the 1-inch ones, I simply slide over by half an inch. I can go ahead and mark, and boom. This hole at the end here, apparently also good for hanging it up on pegboards and other wall mounts. And in the amount of comments mentioning that they learned about this thing in their home economics class in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, which was a fun bit of history, so thank you for sharing that. Now this was interesting. Apparently this can even make a bias binding. Let's put it to the test. I've cut myself a 2-inch piece of fabric here, fold over the end on one side, and do the same thing on the other. Make sure that's down to 1 inch. Okay, perfect. Okay, and then I'm going to pin on each side like so. There we go. And then I just proceed to pull it through. Hey, look at that. It's working. All right. Press that down. And I will need to balance that out a little bit because it's pulling off to one side. Now, fold this in half. One more time. Lay it underneath. Bring the gaugey bit back in. Reposition my needle. And voila! Well, now, if this isn't just the most genius, clever use I've seen of this thing yet. Isn't that neat? Well, there we go. I'll tell you what, filming these videos sure does make a boy hungry, so it's time for a watermelon break. Chewing sounds great on camera, doesn't it? Which has absolutely nothing to do with the fact that that last technique also makes for fantastic bias binding. So, give it a try. Editing corner, we're really gonna have to keep it moving. Save 10% on your next fabric order over at Fabric LA with my coupon code CORNQ at checkout. They've got a great selection of knits. Maybe you're thinking felts. They've got you covered. Oh, but you got bold ideas. You want some faux fur. Well, wouldn't you know it, it's one of their specialties. If you got any questions, just reach out to Emery and his team and they'll get you sorted out. Fabric LA. Knitters, quilters, it's time for us to have a little dialogue now. Now, full disclosure, I do not knit, and I'm early in my quilting days, so if I get these things wrong, please do correct me down in the comments. So in knitting, there's this thing known as counting the gauge. And the idea is basically that you want to know how many rows of stitching there is per inch. And so having these notches every inch helps you to simply lay that puppy on top of a sample piece and count that out. And the reason you want to know that is because the pattern will tell you how many you want so that you can get the width of the garment that you're making correct and doesn't end up too wide or too narrow. I think that's it. And now the quilting bits. One thing I had mentioned in my original video is that the end of the seam gauge here is 5/8 of an inch, which is the standard seam allowance for your average garment that you're sewing. Well, it turns out from here to the edge here is 1/4 of an inch. So if I go ahead and lay that on top there, like so, that's the 1/4 inch mark right there. That's the start of my ruler there. It's 1/4 of an inch. And 1/4 of an inch is the standard seam allowance in quilting. But not only that, to take it one step further, the opposite side here is what's known as a scant 1/4 of an inch. So you can still see the little 1/4 inch markings on each side. So it's just a pinch ever so slightly less than 1/4 of an inch. And when you're quilting, you fold the seam allowance, most often, both over to one side. And so just a little bit of fabric gets lost to the curvature of the fold on one side. So between your scant 1/4 inch plus that little bit of fold, you get a full 1/4 inch. Does that make sense? And you're putting so many pieces together that if you're losing that little bit of fold fabric over the course of the many pieces for the quilt, well then eventually your quilt is going to be too small and pieces won't line up anymore. So a scant 1/4 inch is ever so slightly less than 1/4 of an inch, and it just so happens that's this bottom piece right here. And apparently it gets used outside of the world of sewing, knitting, and quilting as well. Like numerous military folk mentioned that it was used to line up their medals. Various woodworkers and engineer types chimed in that it's something they've used. And then, most interestingly, this one guy mentioned that he'd found it in his mom's junk drawer, used it to do some metal work on his car, and proceeded to use it for the rest of his life. Moving forward, he used it. And only after watching my video, realized that it's actually meant for sewing. So, how about that? In my original video, I also shared a theory someone had mentioned as to why 5/8 of an inch is the seam allowance we use on patterns. And oh boy, were there some thoughts on that. One person believed that when patterns for home sewists became a thing, the various big pattern makers got together and decided, you know what, 5/8 is it. That's what we're going to do. Another person mentioned that, well, in metric, the seam allowance is typically 1.5 centimeters, and so 5/8 is the closest, so that's the reason. Yet another person said that, well, back in the day, seam allowances used to vary from, say, the shoulder to the side seams. And so with these home patterns being a thing, well, why don't we just make them all 5/8 of an inch, and that way we don't have to mark it out on the patterns, it's just consistent. And then if it needs to be reduced, well, then the instructions tell you to trim it down. Yet another person mentioned that 5/8 of an inch is also a good seam allowance amount to do French seams, so between the two, it's a marvelous number. Yet another person mentioned, well, 5/8 of an inch of seam allowance is a carryover from the days of hand sewing, and our thumbs are roughly 5/8 of an inch, either from side to side or from the tip to the end of the bed of the nail, and so that's the right amount to grip onto, hence 5/8 of an inch. And then yet another comment said, no, it's because the boning in the old-timey dresses was 5/8 of an inch, and that 5/8 would perfectly fit within the seam allowance, so hence it's the boning. Is one of them correct? Are all of them correct? Who knows? But I think it's interesting. And you know what? Maybe it's just a collection of various different reasons, and we've sort of evolved as a society to decide, you know what? Let's do 5/8 of an inch. Okay, so giant thank you if you've made it this far in the video. Perhaps you want to learn how to draft patterns. Well, you can check out my courses available at that URL right there. Maybe you want to become a member on Patreon. Not only are you financially supporting me, but you get all kinds of perks and benefits, and there's a lovely little chat going in the Discord, so how about that? Alternatively, check out the shop page and get your sewing supplies. And most importantly, if you've made it to the very, very end here, well, let me know down in the comments by telling me your fruit of choice. Like watermelons, to be honest, cherries are better. My favorite, but watermelon, close second. What do you like?